up, Badlands? Explain those Badlands. That's a hell of a name.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of Breaking History. As you can note, I'm by myself. Gordon called me up, and his family has been hit by the seasonal flu. So there's a bit of chaos in the household there. He's taking care of things. He'll be fine. But the kids have come back from school, or I guess wherever they were partying on the holidays, with a pretty nasty whatever it is. So I'm going to be flying solo for today. It is a New Year's Eve special. We are exiting 2025. We're entering 2026. So I figured I would compose a little special something just for the new year, just to keep our minds focused on certain traps, certain aspirations, certain hopes, but also certain points of concern that I think are useful just to have as the mapping in the back of our minds as we navigate through a world which is going to be testing our character like you can't even imagine. So before we do anything today, though, I would like to begin, as usual, with a word from one or two of today's sponsors, starting with Van Man. Here we go. You know about Van Man taking down big toothpaste with all-natural oral care, right? It's the perfect time to grab the dental care bundle to gift. Van Man's tooth powder is loaded with minerals like eggshells and bone and combined with pulling oils and peppermint aloe mouth rinse. It's truly the ultimate fluoride-free dental hygiene bundle that saves you 25% off of individual prices. And the van never stops, introducing Van Man's new Pearl Eye Cream and Sweet Onion Shampoo. Sweet Onion Shampoo, that's it. Head over to badlandsmedia.tv/vanman to see what's new. That's badlandsmedia.tv/vanman. All right. So I read that a little bit fast. All right. The next one we have in the queue here is a Badlands shop. So let's look at Badlands shop, which I think is this one here. All right. When your favorite Badlands show wraps up, head straight to the Badlands shop to discover our handpicked sponsors and exclusive deals. From premium USA-made health supplements to grass-fed meats and patriotic apparel, secure tech gear, and veteran-owned coffee, we've got everything to fuel your American-first lifestyle. Whether it's products spotlighted on the air or essentials for your daily grind, the Badlands shop makes it simple to shop smart and support the cause. Every dollar you spend is a bold stand for freedom, backing patriot entrepreneurs, family-run businesses, and creators who champion our shared values. You're not just grabbing great gear, you're powering the movement that keeps Badlands Media strong. Thanks for choosing businesses that stand with Badlands. Your support keeps the truth rolling. Dive in now at badlandsmedia.tv/shop or click shop from the main menu at badlandsmedia.tv. All right. I think I just hit it again. Oops. Okay, now we can jump into some big ideas. So, I guess what I should say is a few words to open up is that I chose to make a little PowerPoint. Some of what I'm going to say, I delivered in a much shorter, abridged speech, in a sense, almost 2 weeks ago at an eschatology conference in London. I wasn't in London. It was a Zoom keynote address, but this is going to be a lot more expanded. I didn't even have a PowerPoint when I delivered that, so I decided to add a little bit more meat on the bones. And, you know, as everyone knows, I like to make these a little bit more classroom-oriented when I'm writing solo. I do have some quotes. I think that the quotes from key figures who are making history move in an important direction, like those who are closer to the causal nexus, it's important to add a little bit more reality and drama to the stage, to the theater. And I think history is best approached when you do look at it from the standpoint of the principles of drama, especially classical drama. That's something I've made a theme, because what is classical drama? You know, if you think about the essence of what makes a classical piece, or especially a classical tragedy, like a Shakespearean tragedy, a Schiller tragedy, it's that you have good people who have the power to create, to take responsibility, to change their flawed, corrupt thinking their vices that are making them worse. They have all of the power to overcome, but they don't. They give into their ego. They give into their pride. They allow themselves, thus, with that lack of self-awareness, to become increasingly instruments for the will of nefarious actors like Iagos on the stage of Othello, who's capitalizing on the vices of his target victims in order to have them become the instruments for their own destruction. And you could find that across the board. And I think that in human society, you definitely find that. You have situations where human beings overcame their challenges. They became the better part of themselves. They were not tragic. Or inversely, you have cases of ongoing tragedy shaping all of the wars that we could have avoided, and a lot of the traps if we were just more disciplined with our own thinking, if we expected more out of what we could know, what we could do with that knowledge. But because our standards were too low, our mediocrity, normalization was too high, we as humans have too often acted like fools and have fallen into tribal mob rule. And it's always easier to control a mob, to control a herd of humans who don't think of themselves as sovereign individuals, than it is to control individuals. And I think we've all seen examples of the madness of crowds, right? Whether it's within the tulip bubble or the raving hordes that would go and just massacre villages because they were told those are the bad guys in the Middle Ages or throughout the 30 Years' War. Or we see examples of that in our present time, which an individual wouldn't do. But there's something that happens when you put that individual who doesn't fully know themselves within the context of a mob situation, and they will lose their humanity. And they might wake up the next morning with blood on their hands, regretting shamefully what they did, but at the time they would be gripped. A truly sovereign species will not allow that to happen. So hence, those are some of the thoughts I want people to have in their minds as we go through today's lesson. So I chose to tentatively call this How to Navigate the Coming Reset Traps. That'll be more evident as we go through it. I got two quotes here. I enjoy the irony of some of these things, the irony of the fact that we have George Soros, the embodiment of the left anarchist woke dimension perversion of humanity, saying, I consider Xi Jinping the most dangerous enemy of open societies in the world. And he's saying this in 2021. And then you have his sort of right-wing counterpart, Steve Bannon, who's actually called for creating a George Soros-style right-wing movement of NGOs to combat the left-wing Soros operation, but using all of the same techniques. So Bannon himself has situated himself as the Soros of the right, where he has said, China has emerged as the greatest economic and national security threat the United States has ever faced. And this is just a couple of years after he had already said that within 10 years, the war with China will be inevitable, and he has called for a crusade against Chinese communism. So, in fact, Soros and Bannon, though they seem to be, from the bottom-up standpoint, very different people with very different goals and values, you could actually see on some of these core points that really do shape the potential outcome of the next century or more of human civilization, speaking specifically about the oncoming world war that's being built up and baked into the psyche and baked into the military-industrial maneuvering. They're actually much more similar than many people have been led to believe, which is an odd thing. So just hold that irony in mind. This is a long quote, but it's an important quote. It's an important quote because I think we could see amongst many of our friends, our conservative-minded friends, a very clear orientation towards thinking of China as our primary nemesis, our existential enemy that we have to prepare to defeat. But at the same time, it's not specifically a right conservative thing, as the Soros quote pointed out, but this is even Jake Sullivan, a Rhodes Scholar, leading handler of Biden, an advisor, national security advisor at one time. And this is in 2019 at a CIA-sponsored news platform called the China Channel, where he was asked by the interviewer, is it possible to have a strategy that gets people to care but isn't alarmist, idealistic to a fault, or the sort of red-blooded Jacksonian nationalism that could actually end up making the situation around the world worse? Sullivan says, I don't know. We don't actually have a successful example of this in U.S. history. The two moments where the United States really rallied to internationalism were first in the era of Teddy Roosevelt, which was basically about jingoism and imperialism and so forth. And then in the Cold War, when we had a great enemy. So, and of course, he's speaking about Chinese Russian communism. So it's either calling forth manifest destiny under the vision of Teddy Roosevelt and a kind of crudely racialized view of American superiority and American destiny, or it's an all-encompassing conflict against an ideological foe. Those are the two examples we have. So there is an alternative strategy. And part of the reason that people are so into the idea of turning China into the next great enemy, well, there's something in it for everyone, honestly. I mean, there is something in it for the people writing articles in foreign affairs. That's the CFR mouthpiece. There's something in it for progressives who want to see much more domestic investment in the USA. So I think that this is the direction we are heading in because there is something in it for everyone. But that very much concerns me. I would like to say that there is an alternative, which is much more focused on a set of threats and challenges that requires the United States to rally the world a la Independence Day, the movie, you know, like aliens are coming. Yeah, right. So he speaks like a frat boy. So like, I'm thinking, you know, if aliens came down, yeah, we'd rally the world and that would be a great story. And I think people would get totally psyched up for it to avoid global annihilation. So I don't know. I don't have a good answer. And because I don't have a good answer and I have not heard one from others, I think that we are creeping towards turning China into that answer. And just saying, you know, that what we are going to do to have an organizing principle for U.S. foreign policy, it's going to be China. When he says he hasn't heard of one from others, this guy is an Oxford Rhodes Scholar, highly vetted. He's lying through his teeth. What he's basically doing is a big reveal. And I think that he's sort of throwing all of those different scenarios that have been gamed out into the mix of what's being applied in the form of some weird stew of social engineering. Because we do have, as people who have been following the Movie Nights with Matt program I've been hosting for a short period, there is an operation to utilize the UFO disclosure operation that's in play and is accelerating, will be accelerating heavily in the opening months of 2026 as one way of organizing people, society around a threat from beyond to shape the fears of a scared hive of humans. You have also the restoration of a certain form of Teddy Roosevelt identity around this idea of what, you know, Teddy Roosevelt did with the Monroe Doctrine corollary. That's something in play. But you also have the question of this outward organization of China as the enemy. And in the broader context of this interview, I didn't point this out. The issue is how to pull off a new Pearl Harbor incident. So how do we organize people? How do we get that type of control over society that we were able to enjoy after Pearl Harbor when there was a feeling of being attacked, a threat from beyond, or again in 9/11, which was a new Pearl Harbor approach that in the case of 9/11 had provably a directing hand of intelligence forces working deeply within Washington, D.C. itself, as well as in England and beyond, as people who've watched Brad Zerbo's Codex 9/11 have known. But the idea was the effect psychologically of organizing everybody left and right and everything in between around fear, around a desire for revenge, around a desire to fight them before they can hurt us again. That psychological profile is what they've wanted as a perfect effect for a society that will demand their own enslavement, which is exactly what we did when we started demanding for the bombing of countries in the Middle East that had nothing to do with that event of 9/11 and the broader security state surveillance dragnet that we allowed and even demanded that the Five Eyes engage upon in the ensuing wake. So keep that stuff in your head. Because there's a lot of discussion around the question of, you know, the USA as victims of big bad China, big bad Russia. The left who follow George Soros' sort of narratives tend to think they've been given a story that they're the victims because of big bad Russian manipulation. The big bad Ruskies of the Cold War are still at it, controlling Donald Trump and conservatives and and MAGA influencers. It's all the Russians. And so they've got their own victim state that's being cooked up into their heads. The conservatives don't think that conservatives necessarily are immune. There's been a different kind of narrative, but one that instead of focusing on Russia as the enemy, it's now China. So a lot of the same narratives, except China is the one controlling Biden, controlling Justin Trudeau, controlling Carney, controlling everything bad about our world. It's all China, the drugs, the fentanyl, everything. It's all China. And by repeating it and having hypnotic mantras that largely echo a lot of the things that came out of the Cold War, including the, there's a lot of detail. We forget that we didn't ask for any proof that the claims are true or not. And as such, there is the same victim identity that is becoming a new organizing principle. But we forget the fact that when you look at a map, the actual military offensive program, the hard infrastructure power of that's showcasing an intention to expand imperially and subjugate global nations to a certain standard is not coming from China or from the USA. China only has one military base outside of their country that they were invited to build in Ethiopia. It's coming from the USA that has beginning. I mean, Obama definitely expanded this massively into the Asia pivot, but it has grown to the point of being over 150,000 US troops around China's perimeter, very, very, very aggressive military maneuvers and games that are using Japan, Taiwan as new proxies, new Ukraine-style proxies in an oncoming war, which people like Bannon, many people within the U.S. State Department have said is necessary to defeat and subvert through either military or even economic means by cutting off their supply chains, their various resources abroad that they need to input to keep their nation afloat. There's a variety of ways of doing that, or basic national endowment for democracy style chaos operations on the perimeter, getting maybe Taiwan and Cambodia to get into conflicts. These are types of things that I'm not saying Trump is directing, but I'm saying that there are still dealt with vicious forces within the US and British and Canadian intelligence security apparatus that is doing very, very nasty things, which have to be held in mind. And just to keep that in mind as well, that globally speaking, there's over 845 US military bases outside of the USA itself. So as far as who's really pushing a dangerous policy, I really think we have to always look self-reflectively at what we have permitted to grow in the wake of the murder of John F. Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy. So just to keep that in mind, what we've allowed into our society that works because it flatters us. It flatters our morality, that we're better morally than others who don't have the same morality as us. And that type of feeling of superiority, of virtue, is something that you also see catering in a different way in an atheistic language to the left, that virtue signals, that feels that undemocratic impositions of will of the strong onto the deplorables is justified because of the inferiority of the deplorables. But at the same time, there's a different type of the same thing. One thing that Pete Hegseth, who many people watching this might be annoyed with me because I'm critical of Pete Hegseth, but I don't find that his psychology is trustworthy, has put out a book, an organizing manual in 2020 called American Crusade, where he calls for a holy war, a new holy war as an organizing principle of the new century, the new American century, vectored around China and also radical Islam. Now, the thing that bothers me about this is that he never brings up, not denying that radical Islam is not an issue, or that Islamicism is not an issue, or Wahhabite Salafism is not an issue. That's true. But does he ever bring up the CIA's directing role in funding all of the radicalizing madrasas that created Al-Qaeda, that provided support, financial, logistic, and other, to growing this Al-Qaeda operation before and even after 9/11? Not at all. Not at all. It's treated as if it is a purely apolitical, moral thing that must be destroyed through a new crusade. Same thing for China. And I want people to just be directed towards, again, this particular tattoo of the Kingdom of Jerusalem flag on his chest, which is a peculiar choice of a tattoo, because this is, for those who I think most people probably know. This was the symbol for the flag of the Crusader Kingdom of Jerusalem, which was largely a Templar kingdom that had a foundation in the concept of an eschatology that involved the necessity to purge humanity through the cleansing blood of violence. So it's purgative sacrifice. That was part of the ideology behind the Crusades, but also the idea of rebuilding Solomon's temple, which was why the Templars themselves, with directing support from a number of Gnostic Sufi cults, had made the decision to set their headquarters under the location we know today of the Temple Mount, of Solomon's temple, of Solomon's mines, that is to say, which the idea was always to rebuild Solomon's temple to usher in a new age, what says the Templars. So that's something to also hold in mind, that these are the agencies that basically had a occult black magician class, an initiatory degree of initiatory processes, an overseeing of ritual murder between religions that went on for a long time, and that controlled international banking and ports. They were by far the dominant controllers of banking, of finance, money lending throughout that entire Middle Age period. Did that ever get resolved? Did that really truly get resolved? We have here the current Grandmaster Cardinal Edwin O'Brien of the Equestrian Order of the Holy Sepulchre. The Holy Sepulchre is a set of knights and dames that still exist today. They were set up in the wake of the first, or at the opening shots of the First Crusade in 1098. That is their symbol on the left. That's him with Pope Francis, and who took the name based on the Francis of Assisi, the founder of the Franciscan Order, which was itself also an order of that preached in the Crusades, that supported the Crusades, and that also, with the Dominicans, oversaw the Inquisition that went on for several centuries. So that's also an important thing, just to keep in mind that it still exists, right? This is what manages the Holy Sepulchre today in Jerusalem. And my cat is making a lot of noise. I'm just gonna. Yes, I threw a book at my cat, but it was beside it just to scare it. Don't worry, I didn't try to hurt the cat, though he's still meowing, so that failed. The unification of tech bros and theo bros. So here's another anomaly that I want people to hold in mind, that within certain policymaking circles today, shaping the idea of what future U.S. policy will be, we find a strange confluence of seeming opposite ideologies. You have, on the one hand, Silicon Valley technocrats, transhumanist types, who seem the opposite of Christian, the most opposite that you could possibly imagine, or Silicon Valley tech nerds who have become the multi-billionaire class, overseeing as contractors the new AI rollouts, the new surveillance state, the new contractors for the military-industrial complex. They seem to be the most opposite of religious that you could imagine. But yet there is a common point of cooperation that we find with the Christian Zionist networks that also have been baked into the U.S. Security establishment for a long time. And let's just look at a couple of those core points of similarity. There are common beliefs, like I point out here on the slide, under different names. You have a singularity teleologically pulling humanity towards a future bifurcation point punctuated by cataclysm, dominance of evil, mass death, and violence for many years. So this belief in a future moment of cataclysm pulling us towards that future moment, which has different colorings, but is something shared amongst both groupings. Maybe they take on different colors, but here, let's just look at what that means. The idea that there are supernatural forces of deep state managed ETs and AI gods for the atheists, and legions of angels and demons for the faithful Christians. So that supernatural entities, Pete Hegseth has even started coming out, not Pete Hegseth, sorry, Peter Thiel, people know has come out vocally, passionately giving speeches about the Antichrist, right? So all of a sudden we're finding that it's not so atheistic at all. There is actually a language of end times Christian eschatology. The Antichrist concept is being put forth by many of these figures around Pete Hegseth, except his idea of it is based upon the idea of the mechanisms of globalization, the mechanisms itself of technology that are expressing a material clothing for the disembodied spirit of demons and the Antichrist to express themselves. That's how it's being reframed. And you see it also in a lot of the movies and a lot of the shows that have been receiving an immense amount of funding. It takes a lot of money and funding and energy to build these sorts of ongoing TV shows, The Three-Body Problem. There's so many things on Netflix, on Prime, on Hollywood movies that all advance this kind of idea of the necessary unification of tech and demonology. So let's look at the founding fathers of transhumanism, okay? There's a paradox here too. So let's look at another anomaly, that you have the two core founding fathers that is widely recognized is a priest, a Catholic priest, and a radical Darwinian atheist named Julian Huxley and Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. Oops. Sorry, I'm just losing track of my... There we go. So is it a paradox that an atheist and a Christian co-created transhumanism as a movement, as more than a movement, I would say, as a religion? Well, again, not really, because both of them share a common belief in a secret doctrine for the elect and an outward public doctrine for the masses, something that we'll see is also contained within Templarism and Jesuitism as well. Now, in the case of Julian Huxley, we'll say a little bit about who he is, but first just to say what he believed in, that his esoteric doctrine for the elites was a form of Darwinism, which allowed for directionality in evolution and order. But his version of Darwinism, or Darwinism per se, denies the existence of good and evil. So in his world, it's purely the might makes right. Those who have the power to impose their will onto the weak are able to come out as winners. That's what we'll call is good. You know, it's their ability to impose definitions and to kill the weaker, inferior races, as Darwin's system outlined is the way all of nature must be interpreted, must be assumed to operate. And that's why species go extinct, because they were inferior than the more effective ones. And in the public doctrine of Darwinism, for the masses who are uninitiated, there is a rejection of the idea that there is a directionality. It's all random mutations, randomly creating attributes, but with no directionality. That is outrightly banned from the public Darwinian gospel. From the Julian Huxley, and I would say all of even his grandfather, Thomas Huxley, who was the handler of Darwin, there was always an esoteric special version for the elites, which allowed for directionality, but it denied morality. So the directionality was just based upon the control would be oriented ever more to those most fit, while those unfit would lose control of influencing the system as a system of life. And again, in that exoteric public doctrine, there's a promotion of radical empiricism. For those who are not going to be initiated, they have to be adherents to the idea that truth is something you could only access through your senses. Smell, taste, touch, sight, things you can weigh is the only foundation materially of getting an idea of what's truth. Statistical bottom-up thinking, you could only use statistical probability theory to allow your mind to penetrate the secrets of nature. Nothing more than that, which, of course, if you use that, you're screwed. You can't discover anything truthfully. And as I mentioned, the assumption of randomness is causal. In the human realm, the application of eugenics to perfect the universe. So in the case of Julian Huxley, he was himself first the treasurer and then the president of the Eugenics Society of Britain. That is, eugenics being the human version of Darwinism applied to managing human society. So taking the logic of Darwin's natural selection and then applying it to managing those more and less fit to survive, who will be the useless eaters to be eliminated, who will be bred, whether by controlled breeding, the way the Nazis were doing, setting up, good-looking Aryans to procreate, or by a laboratory, maybe the assistance of certain chemicals, certain, CRISPR technology, certain genetic modifications, certain test tube babies, as Julian's brother Aldous Huxley had developed in great detail within his many works, not the least of which was his Brave New World. So there's a number of ways that eugenics, as applied, works or doesn't work, whatever you want to call it. But that's what Julian Huxley is doing with his secret doctrine. And again, that's a picture of him with his grandfather, Thomas Huxley, the handler of Darwin and the founder of the X Club that he set up in 1865, which people can look at. There's a big chapter in my book on The Clash of the Two Americas, Volume 1, which goes through this X Club at Cambridge and the Royal Society, which served as a form of invisible college. This is the same thing that set up the Isaac Newton Project a couple of centuries earlier as an invisible college of Rosicrucian initiates that would create and push a fake materialist Cartesian science for the stupid people, for the slaves, and then reserve a hermetic, magical system of control for the initiates. Both would ultimately, in my view, be incapable of attaining any access to truth, to actual truth, but both would be useful at creating false dialectics. As we know that Descartes was both a Jesuit trained operative as a mercenary for the Habsburg Empire, but he was also into Rosicrucianism. So he was both, even though the Rosicrucians are treated as though they're enemies of the Jesuits, which are, it seems to be a false dialectic in many ways. When you look at Julian Huxley, who was a part of the Fabian Society, as well as many other misanthropic eugenicists, that was also a society that was self-consciously grounded in its identity around the Jesuit constitution. So that's another thing to keep in mind. So what is it that Ignatius Loyola, as, again, a mercenary for the Spanish Habsburg Empire, who goes through a managed set of altered states, religious ecstatic experiences, and comes to believe that he is endowed with creating a new form of religion? What is he doing in his spiritual exercises? What is he doing in his meditations? What type of indoctrination is he encouraging followers adopt when they become convinced, or should convince themselves through mantras and self-hypnosis, that snow is black or that black is white if your superior so wills it? Why is he saying that everybody must follow the doctrine of Aristotle if you are going to be a proper Jesuit? You must look at the world through Thomas Aquinas's method and Aristotle's eyes. What does he mean by that? Because that's the secret into how society has been managed, or has been induced to self-manage, and how this whole game of left versus right is controlled. So you've got these guys, Julian Huxley, Thomas, Aldous, the Huxleys as a whole, seem to be devoted to this particular way of organizing humanity. Again, some of his milestones, just to get across the importance of this man as more than simply just a goofy British guy. He was, I mentioned, the vice president of the British Eugenics Society from 1957 to 63. Before that, he was the treasurer. He was the founder and first president of the United Nations Education, Science, and Cultural Organization in 1947, and people can even read online his UNESCO, Its Purpose and Philosophy manifesto that he authored, which shaped the educational and cultural policies of the European and North American cultures for the next 50, 60 years. In it, he explicitly calls for eugenics to be reinstated as the new macro religion, the meta religion, the meta science controlling all other sub religions and sub sciences. He also calls for the need to train the children born after World War II in a new ideology that would get them to accept the necessity of one world government and getting rid of national sovereignty. That's another part of his gospel. Again, people can read this online. Again, I mentioned he coined the term for the first time transhumanism alongside Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, the Jesuit priest, whom he also saw as a great friend and ally. They wrote many letters together. They published together. He wrote the foreword to Chardin's Omega Point, or the phenomenon of man, which also introduces the concept of a future Omega Point pulling us forward towards a theosophical-like point of Christ consciousness as a point of the future that deterministically eliminates our free will. So these two gentlemen, though one is, again, a radical atheist and the other is a nominal Catholic, they're actually completely on board with the same overall view of the world. And, Huxley was also the father of modern pagan Gaia religion. So there's a it's not just kind of similar, the ancient Gaia and Earth Mother worshiping cults of the ancient world and today's environmentalist movement that really grew out of the 1960s baby boomer counterculture. It was direct. It was very self-aware. It was thought through. It's not a coincidence that there's similarities. It's the same thing. And Julian Huxley did this by founding the International Union for the Conservation of Nature in 1947, the same year that he was setting up UNESCO as the world's first conservation agency that would be mandated officially to protect natural ecosystems from human economic development. So, no hydroelectric dams for Africa, or India. That would be now bad under the new ethos that he's putting forth with this movement. And he also co-founded the World Wildlife Fund for Nature in 1961. That's also an interesting point. Are these disconnected from his belief in eugenics and transhumanism? I don't think so. And the fact that he's also, keep in mind, setting up the World Wildlife Fund for Nature at a year that he's still the vice president of the British Eugenics Society, and he's setting it up with Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands and Prince Philip Mountbatten, two men who openly called for culling the human herd, one of whom was the founder of the Bilderberger Group, and the other one who oversaw, along with Maurice Strong and Louis Mortimer Bloomfield, the fellow who oversaw the murder of John F. Kennedy, that Mortimer Bloomfield, who was the vice president of the World Wildlife Fund for Nature under Prince Philip Mountbatten, who called for being reincarnated as a deadly virus to solve overpopulation. Strange choice of friends, right? And the fact that these institutions exert so much influence on the ethical transformation of especially Western baby boomers under the time that the UNESCO was controlling the education program for said baby boomers and forcing young people to start reading things like Aldous Huxley's Brave New World before they could even develop their critical thinking skills. Also, probably not a coincidence. So now let's look at Chardin. Pierre Teilhard de Chardin also had a secret doctrine. His was fundamentally amoral, the secret doctrine. His public one was all based upon promoting words like morality, nice words that make him very attractive and very popular even today amongst many Christians of all walks of life, Catholic, Protestant, you name it. Many people like Chardin today because he uses nice, flowery language. It's a lot of it is very nice. But his esoteric doctrine that we're going to come to see more of in some of the slides to come was fundamentally amoral. It was purely Nietzschean. He was a follower of Friedrich Nietzsche. He did believe in eugenics as the master science of all sciences. He talks about how to apply it. He promotes a world government by the destruction of free will through his concept of an inevitable singularity. That's the idea that he calls an omega point pulling us towards it. The singularity, by the way, is the same thing that we have heard. There's a number of leading Silicon Valley transhumanist types who have been pushing this notion of a singularity, who are lead engineers at Google, CEOs of many of the Silicon Valley multinational enterprises. Ray Kurzweil is a major one, who's a transhumanist who's been promoting his version of Chardin's singularity or omega point in the form of the singularity. Where supposedly at this imaginary future moment, whether people play with the time 2045, 2050, 2060, but the point is they all believe in this idea that machines will become self-conscious. They will all of a sudden be endowed by all of the faculties of the human condition, and will thus necessarily, because they're pure logic, judge us to be what the oligarchy believes we are, a parasite, a pox on nature that must be eliminated like a cancer would be eliminated to save Gaia, the pure host that we've parasitically destroyed, Gaia, this painful, crying Earth Mother that we've been raping through mining and developing infrastructure. So it's really quite rooted actually in a misanthropic cynicism and a hate of humankind that animates what seems to be a very sparkly language, which then the false choice becomes either go to war with the machines, a la Luddites, right? And just start destroying the machines, maybe a la John Savage from the Brave New World, or merge with the machines, become the servant, the transhumanist integrated servant of the machines, and maybe have a good job, get your social credits in your whatever type of form of payment that they're going to have in this digital currency age, whatever, as long as you have the right opinions, right behavior, you've gotten your transhumanist whatever injections or whatever you want, right? And you could play the game. Maybe you could become even a Mustafa Mond. Maybe you could rise in the echelons to become an alpha plus plus instead of just being an alpha or a beta. So that's a sort of disgusting thinking there. Now, exoterically, the public doctrine that is only for the uninitiated. Well, for that, Chardin had his idea of a naive Christian faith driven by Christ consciousness, love, brotherhood, and moral values for everybody. Sounds all very nice, and it makes the poison that much more attractive and tasty without realizing that there's poison. Now, what else is Chardin doing? Part of his life, the reason why he became very noteworthy in the 20th century is that he was known as a modernist Jesuit. So he led the modernist camp after George Tyrrell, who was his mentor, passed away, and he took up the torch. And part of the modernist goal was to literally transform Christianity by making it relevant. And their idea of making Christianity relevant was by getting it to integrate with Darwinistic natural selection theories. That the new science of Darwin and the Huxley X Club meant that Christianity's thesis that human beings were divine, had an immortal soul, were naturally had a purpose that was good, morally so in the universe, that was no longer acceptable. And to be acceptable, you had to integrate with the new science of Darwin. And that's what Chardin literally made his entire life's devotion, was integrating Darwinism and Christianity. Well, and he could only do that by maintaining a frock in some way, right? What you have in front of you is a picture of an illustration in 1912, December 24th or so, 1912, from the London News, of a very creative drawing of what looks to be a Neanderthal that was based upon certain skull fragments and jaw fragments and a couple of teeth that were discovered in Piltdown near London. The person who discovered it was Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. And he did it when he was on holiday from Egypt or something. And he just showed up in the right location at like a work site where a house was being built. And was like, hey, what are these bone fragments? And he basically assembled a team from the Royal Society from Cambridge who came down. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle also was very happy to immediately get on site and help excavate and pull together these fragments that were supposed to prove to the world that Darwin was right. Because here was finally that missing link that didn't seem to exist anywhere, since everywhere in the fossil records, you never saw any evidence in any species that Darwin's system was true, because Darwin's system demanded gradualism, slow, gradual mutations, ever so slowly causing species to change, which you should have expected to see as we dug deeper into the older fossil records. We didn't see that. What we see is discontinuous transformations of whole systems. No missing links are to be found between. So here, all of a sudden, was that missing link, that smoking gun that proved Darwin was right, or so Chardin would have the world believe. And what was discovered, unfortunately, only like 15 years later, was that Chardin was basically pulling a giant hoax together. Who goes on vacation and then to London of all places and just happens to stumble on the site that proves Darwin is correct, on like a Saturday afternoon? Nobody does that. And what was discovered is that after the propaganda had done its work for a decade, then somebody had the thought to say, well, hey, how about we actually just test to see if the skull is real? Is the jaw real? Is there any evidence of a hoax? Somebody did the work. I don't know who that was, but they basically discovered that the teeth that Chardin found next to the so-called jaw were teeth of a canine, that the jaw itself was from an orangutan, and the skull was from some human. And so there was basically, and a certain amount of forging, certain dyeing techniques that were used to make them seem a little bit older than they were, that made the coloring of the bones appear to be more visually similar. but it was a giant hoax. So he was willing to take part in a hoax consciously to merge Christianity and Darwinism. Why would he really do that at the end of the day, right? I would say just one other thing. I don't have a slide on this. I don't think I do, at least. Let's go see. I don't think I have a slide on this. I don't have a slide on this. Damn it. Okay, he did this again. After he was caught red-handed, he had already been at this point expelled from Europe and told to go do missionary work in China and don't publish anymore because ultimately you're insurrectionary. And he agreed and he went to China. He spent, I think, like 20 years in China. He hated the Chinese. He thought that they were subhuman. And I got some quotes. He never even bothered learning the Chinese language. It's like you're living in China for 20 years. You don't learn the language. But he did find himself on a Rockefeller Foundation expedition in Peking for a few weeks. And on that expedition, while he arrived, all of a sudden, 1926 happens. He's on the site and the Peking man is discovered. So even though the Piltdown man was proven a hoax, now the Peking man is basically the Neanderthal. That's the missing link. And basically they find a whole bunch of ribs and skull fragments. And that proves to the world that, in fact, Darwin was right the whole time. Now, it's kind of a point of strange embarrassment, or it should be at least, that in modern academia, they still promote the Peking man as if it was true. However, the day after or the week after he was on site and discovered the Peking man, they put all of the bones, these fragments, into a train, into a box that went on a train, supposedly to go off to a port to be sent to Western universities and laboratories. It was never seen from again. And everyone has to admit that the thing disappeared. The box disappeared. There is no evidence that this thing ever existed. But yet they still promote on Popular Science, on Scientific American, other popularizing science journals, Nature magazine, that this thing was a legitimate discovery by Chardin, and they still treat it as if it's real. It was make-believe. It didn't exist. There's no evidence of it. Oh, and by the way, Nature magazine, that people probably have seen on magazine store bookshelves, that's been around. That was founded in 1869 as the official mouthpiece of Thomas Huxley's X Club. Just saying. People can go and type in X Club if they don't believe me on Google. Go to Wikipedia, type in Nature magazine, and you'll find that's exactly true. So what, I said some harsh things about Chardin's racism. Let's actually just see if Chardin is actually, do his words back up what I just said? Yes, they do. I got two quotes. One from 1929, where he's writing a letter to a fellow. Actually, I don't know who he's writing it to, but there's a 1929 letter where he asks, do the yellows, that is the Chinese, have the same value as the whites? Many missionaries say that their present inferiority is due to their long history of paganism. I'm afraid that this is only a declaration of pastors. Instead, the cause seems to be the natural racial foundation. Christian love overcomes all inequalities, but it does not deny them. So the natural racial foundations are the cause of the inferiority of the Chinese. You're right. So ignore the Opium Wars, ignore the entire British imperial subversion of China, the foreign manipulation of the civil wars that massacred millions of Chinese, that ignore all of the banking manipulation that turned China from the top economy of the world of the 18th century into an impoverished wasteland of abuse and corruption under British imperial dominance under the century of humiliation that was still going on while he was speaking. Ignore all of that. It's just the natural racial foundations that make them inferior. And he adds to that. I got another letter that he writes in 1936 where he's describing more philosophically the idea of inferior and superior ethnic groups, where he says the philosophical or supernatural unity of human nature has nothing to do with the equality of races in what concerns their physical capacities to contribute to the building of the world. As not all ethnic groups have the same value, they must be dominated, which does not mean they must be despised. Quite the reverse. In other words, at one and the same time, there should be official recognition of, number one, the primacy and priority of the earth over nations, and number two, the inequality of peoples and races. So get this, right there, he's saying that the primacy and priority of Earth itself over nations must be the new ethos. And he's writing this in 1936. This is before Julian Huxley begins to recreate in a more visceral fashion this Gaia cult. But he's already saying that that must be the new set of priorities, is that nations must be subdued under the prioritization of Earth itself and biosystems. And then number two, that the inequality of peoples and races must be adopted as a governing principle. And with that governing principle, that inequality must be formed, as he explicitly says, with the idea that some races simply must be, or ethnic groups must be dominated. And then he says, but we must not despise them. I guess he might be thinking about his dog. He doesn't despise his dog or dogs more generally. They like him, but he likes his dog. But it's a dog to be controlled as a dog, right? He doesn't seem to make any differentiation between the human and the dog essence. So, all right, we got a pretty gross, and there's many more. Actually, I have a big section in volume 4 for those who want to do more digging into Chardin's disgusting mind. I actually have a little bit more, but there's much, much more in a chapter that I have in that book, Clash of the Two Americas, volume 4, Anglo-Venetian Roots of the Deep State. You could see more of this. But I have one more I really wanted to share, where he says, in 1941, March 21st, he says, what increasingly dominates my interest is the effort to establish within myself and to diffuse around me a new religion. Let's call it an improved Christianity, if you'd like, whose personal God is no longer the great Neolithic landowner of times gone by, but the soul of the world. That was 1936. And then he says here, so that was 1936, sorry. And then another letter in 1941, describing his view of himself as the founder of a new religion. He says, I cannot fight against Christianity. I can only work inside it by trying to transform and convert it. A revolutionary attitude would be much easier and much more pleasant, but it would be suicidal. So I must go step by step tenaciously. So this gradualism method of the Fabian society, of the slow gradualism, the slow adaptation and infiltration promoted by the Darwinian view of slow gradualistic changes, that's what is being applied here methodologically in order to, as he says, work inside of it by trying to transform and convert it into an improved Christianity, which transforms God into simply the soul of the world. Again, this is very much based upon the writings of Madame Helena Blavatsky of the Theosophists, who also had her own notion of a homogeneous world soul, devoid of any moral characteristics as a substitute for God. And also Ralph Waldo Emerson, whose world soul was also picked up by Blavatsky and made her own, but who was the founder of the Transcendentalist movement of the 1840s, 30s, 40s, 50s, which people like Edgar Allan Poe were fighting so valiantly against this infiltration, this pagan infiltration of the Christian psyche and especially the American nation per se as a culture. So this is what he's doing. Oh, I forgot I have another last quote. Okay, this is now officially the last quote on eugenics specifically. So people, if they're thinking this sounds a lot like eugenics, but he didn't say he's a eugenicist. Well, actually, 1930, he says, so far, we have certainly allowed our race to develop at random, and we have given too little thought to the question of what medical and moral factors must replace the crude forces of natural selection should we suppress them. In the course of the coming centuries, it is indispensable that a nobly human form of eugenics, on a standard worthy of our personalities, should be discovered and developed. Eugenics applied to individuals leads to eugenics applied to society. So yeah, he's a eugenicist. Now, Julian Huxley, who he's working with, 1957, says, I believe in transhumanism. Once there are enough people who can truly say that, the human species will be on the threshold of a new kind of existence, as different from ours as is from that of the Peking man. It will at last be consciously fulfilling its real destiny. And he wrote this in New Bottles for New Wine, Julian Huxley. And he's directly referencing the Peking man as his part of his polemic, which Chardin was directly, assigned to manufacture for the world, and they both knew it. There's a third character I'd like to introduce, because we're talking about transhumanism, but you can't talk about transhumanism and artificial intelligence as a cult that we've infused a certain theological philosophy into as a governing mechanism that we're led to believe by those oligarchs influencing us must necessarily replace the cancerous parasitical human society. That infusion of that philosophy into the concept of the advancement of technology, and especially machine learning, we can't understand that if we don't look at the figure who worked very closely, both in the Fabian Society, but also in the British Cambridge High Command itself around Julian Huxley, who is known as Lord Bertrand Russell. And I would say largely he was the father of cybernetics and technocracy. Many people may have heard of him. Some may not have. If you've heard of him, maybe you've heard of him as a philosopher, as a scholar, as a Nobel Prize winner, pushing peace and pushing an end to nuclear war throughout the Cold War. You might know him as these things. Ironically, he's the very opposite of what he's been celebrated to be. He was a lifelong eugenicist. He did call for the cleansing of the unfit races of the earth. He was an advisor to the Tavistock psychiatric warfare specialists that shaped so much of the 20th century psychological warfare operations, including MKUltra itself, which grew out of Tavistockian operations in Britain. Tavistock itself was rooted in the town of Bedford, which is the Russell family town that has gone back many centuries. These are the Lords of Bedford. He has been a lifelong champion of one world government. And he was the founding father of cybernetics. And he did that through his foundational work, Principia Mathematica, published from 1910 to 1913 in 3 volumes, which he named it that because he wanted to revive Isaac Newton's Principia Mathematica, which tried to codify all scientific knowledge into a singular manual based upon simple definitions that you memorize and formulas that you memorize that are rooted in tautological sort of circular axioms. Like, why is this true? It's true because my axioms say it's true, right? Why is gravity based upon the inverse square law? Why does that work? Well, it works because the inverse square law says it must work. That there's a reduction of the influence of gravity that reduces by the square root of the distance of that object being shaped by a gravitational field, from that field itself. So as you move away, the gravitational field doesn't decline by double. If you've moved away by a factor of 2, it actually declines by 4 because it's the square root. It's a geometrical change on top of an arithmetic change. And so in a Newtonian system, that answer, when you ask why does that happen, has no answer but to refer to itself. Within the actual system of people who are actually discovering that to be true, and here I'm thinking of people like Johannes Kepler, whom Isaac Newton is stealing discoveries from and repackaging them, there is an answer which is not tautological. It's not circular reasoning. If you were to ask Kepler why is the inverse square law something that applies to the planetary motions, he would tell you because that's a necessary outcome of the harmonic relationship of the planets from the sun. And you could go through his writings and see how he proved the melodic, the harmony of the different tempering of the planets at their maximum speed and minimum speed in the solar system as one system that created musical scales that showcased or organized around musical scales that encompassed both the minor and the major scales. So Kepler proves that. He shows you how that works. He gives you a means by which you can answer the both mechanistic causes of why is there equal area and equal time? Why is there a relationship, a constant that occurs in all planets based upon the cube of the mean distance of planets from the sun related to the square of the periodicity of the planets as a whole around the sun in a year? Why do we have these relationships that are constant throughout the whole solar system? He gives you those mechanistic reasons, but he also gives you and satisfies the first principles as well, going into the intention of the harmoniousness and reasonability of both the creator and the creation that's looking to discover creation itself, and thus become more empowered to participate within that creative process that we're discovering, that we are part of that thing we're discovering. And that's what you don't get with the Newtonian school of British empiricists, of the Invisible College, of the Rosicrucians, the followers of Descartes, of Voltaire, who, by the way, Chardin is also a great-great-great-grandson of Voltaire, who is the big popularizer of Newton. And you don't get that with Bertrand Russell. In fact, you get the complete elimination of that, because what he does while he's mentoring Norbert Wiener, who goes on to found the School of Information Theory and Cybernetics during World War II, what he's doing in that Principia Mathematica is he's saying explicitly that first principles are inaccessible to the mind of man. All we could do is measure empirical data, plug it into formulas that we believe are true, but we cannot ultimately prove are true, and then extrapolate that data into general rules that should give us, according to Bertrand Russell, the power of gods to know everything and be purely omniscient forever and unfold everything that has ever been to moments that he imagines exist, such as the Big Bang, before which there was nothing, and into the future, at which a supposed heat death and the natural principle of death will capture all of existence as a natural state for the rest of eternity. So these are kinds of toxic ideas that are implicitly designed to be infused as Trojan horses into their co-opting of science per se. Now, part of his secret teaching of Bertrand Russell comes through in a book called, in 1930, that he wrote called The Scientific Outlook. I got two quotes. The first one is this: "The scientific rulers will provide one kind of education for ordinary men and women, and another for those who are to become holders of scientific power. Ordinary men and women will be expected to be docile, industrious, punctual, thoughtless, and contented. Of these qualities, probably contentment will be considered the most important. In order to produce it, all the researchers of psychoanalysis, behaviorism, and biochemistry will be brought into play. All the boys and girls will learn from an early age to be what is called cooperative, i.e., to do exactly what everybody else is doing. Initiative will be discouraged in these children, and insubordination, without being punished, will be scientifically trained out of them." If anybody got some goosebumps from traumatic experiences they had in unnatural school experiences, that's why. It was unnatural. What you experienced was not normal. But he describes here a little bit more in detail something that I found to be very useful for my current narrative of the lesson I'm trying to communicate in today's lesson, dealing with the Jesuits, where in the same book he writes, "Psychology, as pursued everywhere in the past, was incapable of giving practical control over mental processes, and never aimed at this result. To this general statement there is, however, one important exception, namely psychology as studied by the Society of Jesus, that is the Jesuits. Much that the rest of the world has only recently understood was apprehended by Ignatius Loyola, and impressed by him upon the order which he founded. The two tendencies which divide progressive psychologists in our day, namely psychoanalysis and behaviorism, are both equally exemplified in Jesuit practice. I think one may say on the whole that Jesuits relied mainly on behaviorism for their own training and upon psychoanalysis for their power over penitence." And that's quite revealing. Keep in mind that the two key figures, the two godheads that were used by the Tavistokian psychiatrists that went on to shape mass psychiatry of the 20th century and beyond, were principally divided by the followers of Sigmund Freud, on the one hand, the founder of psychoanalysis, and also B.F. Skinner and the Skinnerites, also Pavlovians, the followers of Pavlov, who took a seemingly opposite approach, looking purely at behavioral control mechanism, purely at the environment at which Darwinian mechanisms of survival and adaptation would somehow be induced by the patient to adapt to whatever norms are there in the environment. And thus, as Pavlov proved or worked on with dogs, you could train through repetition, through reward, through punishment, certain behavioral outcomes like getting the dog to start drooling at the sound of a bell if he associated the bell with the bacon that he would also receive simultaneously. You didn't have to give him bacon anymore. He could just hear the bell and start drooling. Such things have usefulness in controlling human society if you're a social engineer who doesn't believe in the soul. Inversely, the Freudians would take what appeared to be the opposite approach by saying all truth is purely inward, right? And that by going deep into ourselves, by working on our imagination, by working on our emotions, you can develop powers that you would not have otherwise. That has also usefulness to it if done well, but if done from a dishonest or a sick standpoint, it could also drive somebody crazy, as we've seen many abusive I advise people check out the movie What About Bob as one satirical but I think very truthful exposition of just the incompetence of Freudian psychoanalysis. What About Bob with Bill Murray and Richard Dreyfuss, 1989, great movie. But additionally, you can see how the Jesuits were able to use their control over confessionals, right? Getting their targets that they were handling, whether they were in royalty or anywhere, through confessionals to be able to induce them to become increasingly also their assets through shame, the incubation of guilt, of trauma, and other things that they wanted to get that target to incubate within themselves. Also a very important aspect of infiltration of any society you wish to subvert. And because he brought up the Jesuits, I just thought it would be important, since I began this presentation with a question of the collective unification of a Christian Zionist faction that has an eschatologically similar way of thinking about the world, the restoration of the kingdom of Jerusalem as a Templar kingdom, the idea of a crusade that needs to happen, with the transhumanist groups around Peter Thiel, Kurzweil, Elon Musk, who also believe that technology is a form of antichrist pulling us to a future moment. So where does, since the Jesuitical sort of flavor seems to come up everywhere we look, let's look at who originated Christian Zionism itself, and Zionism per se, both Jewish and Christian flavors. It was actually a Jesuit. This guy, Francesco Ribera, at least took made it into the modern form. It existed in other incarnations earlier. I mentioned the Templars. You had people like Joaquin de Flore, not Joaquin Flores. He's a good guy. Joaquin de Flore, who's a medieval prophet who had an eschatology that formed the backbone of what was later picked up by Ribera, who was a leading figure at the Council of Trent. That was the counter-revolution that made any resolution to the religious wars that had only begun a few years earlier with the opening up of Martin Luther's Protestant movement. It made any type of peaceful resolution completely impossible. The Council of Trent said there will be no negotiations, no reasonable discourse with the Protestants. All we will do is heavy-headed reaction to crush and also to infiltrate where need be. And the Jesuits became the controllers of the Council of Trent itself. It was very aggressive, but this guy Rivera was the founder of the Futurist school. And as was written here by The Beasts and the Little Horn by J.S. Hitchcock, a scholar, he writes that the Futurist school, founded by the Jesuit Francesca Ribera in 1591, looks for Antichrist, Babylon, and a rebuilt temple in Jerusalem at the end of the Christian dispensation. The Praetorist school, founded by the Jesuit Alcazar of 1614, explains the revelation by the fall of Jerusalem, or by the fall of pagan Rome in 410 AD. So part of what he proposed as his new formula for achieving end times was to that he said that the Antichrist must come back. It must be induced to be brought back in. And he wrote this in his Sacrum Beati Ionis Apostoli. I don't speak Latin. I'm not going to read this, but it's commentaries on the apocalypse. That he must push for the abolishment of the Christian religion, that there must be the rebuilding of the Temple of Jerusalem for prophecy to be fulfilled, that Christ must be denied as part of the demands of the Antichrist, that Rome must be destroyed. But then the question becomes, what does that even mean? That the Jews must be also received by said operation, that there must be the killing of two witnesses of God, and the conquering of the world. The attempt to fully conquer the world must be there. And the idea of bringing the Jews back to the Holy Land and the rebuilding of the temple by recreating their Israel as a nation is part of the formula. Now, this kind of falls out of favor for a while, but it's picked up in 1829 by the Archbishop of Canterbury, who his name is S.E. Maitland, and he goes down to the Vatican archives and he finds the works of Ribera. He brings it back, and they form the basis of 5 years of conferences in London called the Aylesbury Conferences. People can Google that. And it's set up by this guy named Henry Drummond in the middle. At the left. And it influences a new movement amongst these imperialistic British imperialists who start following the work of Anthony Ashley Cooper, the 7th Earl of Shaftesbury. He's actually the father of Zionism. And he basically says, okay, well, the problem is the Jews are all spread out. We have to create a new movement that involves putting money into missionaries and propaganda and other things to help convince the Jews of Europe and of Russia to go and live in the desert, that's actually their home. And we have to work them and find a lot of, it's very difficult because they've made their homes Europe and Russia and whatever else for centuries and centuries and centuries. They don't want, it's a hard sell to get them to want to go and live in the desert in order to be the fulfillment of prophecy. That guy on the right is John Nelson Darby, who founds basically modern rapture theology, as well as the idea of interpreting certain writings of Paul's letters to Thessalonians as it is often taught in Pentecostal and a lot of the Baptist and especially Pentecostal churches in America, that is literally a secret rapture. That all comes from John Nelson Darby, who was working with Anthony Ashley Cooper. He's himself a high-level figure who's the godson of Lord Nelson of the Battle of Trafalgar. And he's doing tours of America to basically convince Americans that America itself is unholy, that Russia is unholy, that if America breaks apart, that's good because it's the fulfillment of prophecy. And he's doing this in the 1840s, 50s, 60s, during the Civil War, trying to convince Americans that they should not fight to keep the Union whole, because by breaking up the Union, we are fulfilling prophecy, that this is the battle of Gog and Magog is now. That was part of his messaging, and it actually was pretty crippling. It did a lot of damage when you needed people to fight, and they were sitting on their barn roofs waiting to be beamed up because it's the rapture. It was very difficult. But he's also the founder of the Plymouth Brethren, the exclusive Plymouth Brethren that generates the figure of Aleister Crowley, right, who comes out of the Plymouth Brethren, many other subversive agents. But the fact that you have British imperialists founding Christian Zionism and Zionism per se, who are tied themselves to the teachings of Jesuits, that's something mostly overlooked. People don't like thinking on that level because I think there's probably a certain amount of intellectual laziness, maybe a fear that I can't go there. It's too much. It's too heavy to think about. I want to think about easy things that are not too challenging. So there's a lot of bite-size, things for us to swallow that are not difficult. They satisfy a sense of feeling like we have all the knowledge and we don't have to go further. And that's a problem, especially when you look at who's actually playing the game and how the oligarchy is much more rigorous with their mind than many of their victims are. And this brings me to one of the last few slides I have, which is by Albert Pike, who many people know. That's him there on the left with his Scottish Rite Freemasonic regalia. That's him on the left is a photograph. On the right, that's his statue in Washington, D.C., the only Confederate general whose statue exists in Washington, D.C. is right there. It was actually installed in 1902 by Teddy Roosevelt to inaugurate the new age of the Roosevelt corollary, because Albert Pike was also a believer that America must subdue the inferior cultures and races of the world, both within the slave states, but also within the empire of the Golden Circle that he called for creating, that would expand with no particular end after the Union would be defeated in the Civil War. So he says in his Morals and Dogma, the manual that sort of rebranded or upgraded, I guess, the initiatory rites of the 32 of the 33 degrees of the Scottish Rite, he says the Templars were unintelligent and therefore unsuccessful Jesuits. Their watchword was to become wealthy in order to buy the world. They became so, and in 1312 they possessed in Europe alone more than 9,000 seigneuries. Riches were the shoal on which they were wrecked. They became insolent and unwisely showed their contempt for religious and social institutions which they aimed to overthrow. Their ambition was fatal to them. In my research, I will say that he is correct, that the Jesuits were more successful Templars, and there is a direct lineage from the Templars that went underground, they didn't disappear, to the emergence in 1534 of what became the Jesuits around a certain nexus, a group around Loyola and Francis Xavier at the Sorbonne before it was officially ordained in 1540 and set up the Council of Trent and everything else that came with. There is something very similar. There's actually not even similar. It is a direct continuity. And for those who want to know more about that, if you want to know more about that, really, and you really wanted to do a bit of heavy lifting, I would advise check out Cynthia Chung's current series. My wife's series currently on cynthiachung.substack.com is painting the picture of a lot of that environment. And also my Revenge of the Mystery Cults, Mystery Babylon in the Age of Aquarius. So that's Revenge of the Mystery Cults, Volume 1, does go through that in a good deal of detail. So just putting that out there for people who want to give themselves actual earned knowledge this 2026, keep that in mind. And I forgot to mention that Albert Pike was also the founder of an organization called the Ku Klux Klan, the KKK, the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan. And the Ku Klux means, literally, it's a reference to the earlier Knights of the Golden Circle that he also was a leading member of as a Confederate general. Had about 100,000 paramilitary members in this order that was set up around the same year as the B'nai B'rith had been set up in 1851 or 1852. And it literally just changed its name and became the KKK. Ku Klux is Greek for circle. And that's a picture of them with a burning cross has often been their stamp of recognition. And they're on the right. And they were set up, by the way, 1865, the same year Thomas Huxley is setting up the X Club, the same year as you have the entire British Empire rebranding itself in order to reconquer a world that was moving in a different direction at the time that they had to subvert. And what you have there is a modern image of an Easter Sunday ritual that happens every year by members of the Order of the Holy Sepulchre. And what you see on their uniforms behind their strange ghost pictures or their ghost costumes is exactly what you think it is. It is the flag of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. So that's also something that I find an interesting similarity, an interesting fashion choice. It makes me wonder, why did the KKK pick that particular design for their uniforms? Why did they use the Gnostic sorcery heraldry of initiatory rites, having a grand wizard and other things that implied a certain pagan undertone to a nominally surface Christian, white Christian nationalist movement? It makes me wonder, are there deeper similarities to be found in a conscious decision to model themselves off of something that was already there in Jerusalem and still continues to be there? I'm just saying, I don't have an answer for that one at this phase in my research, but it's a question that I think is a valid one. And just to be reminded, restoring the Kingdom of Jerusalem, we have Steve Bannon, we have calling for a three-state solution that involves reintroducing the Crusader kingdom into the Middle East as the solution to the crises of the Middle East. We have Alex Jones calling for the restating of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. We've got many influencers, Nick Fuentes and others, coming on record calling for the restoration of Templarism, of the restoration of the noble monarchs, the noble princes, the noble elites, with a new heraldry that will become the replacement of the corrupt system of this technocracy, Klaus Schwabian movement of corruption that must create a new era of elites. That's something that's out there. I'm not making this up. And the fact that it looks a lot, that it involves something going down in the Middle East and something to do with the rebuilding of the Third Temple is also a factor. And people have seen me put this image out quite a bit, but I just found it very interesting that the idea of Greater Israel that was promoted by many of these anti-Semitic fascists in the 19th century, who are already pushing this idea that Israel not only has to be recreated to fulfill prophecy, but that must grow far beyond the current limits that we currently see to encapsulate a region which looks a lot like, if you look at the right map there, the Neo-Babylonian Empire, where the Jews were held in captivity for 70 plus years, where that very same empire seems to look a lot like what certain people want to revive with their idea of a greater Israel in order to achieve certain sick notions of prophecy. So that was the end of today's lesson. There was a lot there. I realized that I just gave a pretty thick, oops, just lost myself there. I realized that I just gave a pretty thick set of stories and slides, but I want people to, again, think about doing heavier lifting than you're used to doing, because we're going into a world that requires the full activation of the cognitive and moral powers of all of us, because there's a lot. There's a lot of lies. There's a lot of fraud. There's a lot of sophistry, half-truths that are going to be getting good people to become the instruments of their own self-destruction if we're not really sharper than we ever thought we could be. So I'm just going to quickly scan through here. I was not, because I was going through my actual PowerPoint. I wasn't looking, as I'm very poor at looking at the comments. I wasn't paying too close attention, but I am now. So I'm just scanning quickly in the comment section. Somebody's asking, where is Ghost? Ghost is tending to his flu-ridden family. They'll be fine. They're just dealing with a bad flu that hit the household. Yeah, okay. I'm realizing I can't do this. There's too many comments. So I do apologize for people who did have thoughtful comments or questions that you threw out there. I do apologize profusely that I would love to have shared them and addressed them, and I can't. However, you could always message me. That's one thing you can do. If you've got a good question or you want to know how to buy the books, you can always message me through CanadianPatriot.org. That's it right there under my name on the screen. As one place. You could also go to MatthewEhret.substack.com. And I think you could do direct messages that way, or risingtidefoundation.net. And you could message us through the website, and we get those messages, and I can address that. So without further ado, I think, this has been pretty fun. I want to wish everybody a happy new year and all the best going into the coming 2026. I hope that it awakens the best of all of us, and that the future, that the destiny, that's the one thing I'll say. The one point I'll agree with these freaks that I was exposing today is that I do agree that we do have a destiny in the future, but it's not a destiny that negates free will. It requires our activation of our reason, our morality, and our choices. But I believe that we're designed and created for a much, much better future than the one planned for us by these sick misanthropic oligarchs. And that future is something that I think we can all play a role in amplifying to different degrees to bringing about. So with that, Happy New Year, everybody, and I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much for joining us, and don't forget to hit the thumbs up on this video. And a special thank you to all of our advertising partners. Please remember to shift your dollars to support those businesses that support Badlands Media.